This morning at 10 a.m., something extraordinary unfolded that's now sending shockwaves through the legal world, and most people have no idea what's really happening. Federal marshals showed up at Mar-a-Lago, but this wasn't another political circus or media stunt. This was cold, calculated debt collection, the kind that happens when more than $500 million in court judgments go unpaid and someone finally decides enough is enough. Here's what nobody's talking about. Over $500 million in legal debts have been piling up since January of last year, and not a single penny has been paid. Think about that for a second. More than $500 million that courts have said must be paid, and the response has been radio silence. Today, the legal system stopped asking nicely. The seizure order that brought federal marshals to that property this morning represents the culmination of something far more significant than one debt collection case. What we're witnessing is the moment when America's civil justice system either proves it has teeth or reveals itself as a toothless tiger that only works against people who can't afford to ignore it. Let me break down what actually happened, because the confusion out there is intentional and the truth is being buried under political noise. 3 separate legal cases, 3 separate courtrooms, 3 separate juries or judges all looked at evidence and came to the same conclusion: pay up. January 2024, a defamation case resulted in an $83 million judgment. February 2024, a fraud case ended with a $355 million judgment plus interest that keeps climbing every single day. March 2024, another defamation case from a completely different plaintiff added $91 million more to the tab. Now here's where it gets interesting. Every single one of those cases followed the exact same playbook after the verdict came down. The winning side sent formal payment demands. Standard legal procedure. You lost, here's what you owe, here's when it's due. And every single time those demands were met with the same strategy: file appeals, delay enforcement, pay nothing, wait it out. Appeals are absolutely legal. Anyone has the right to challenge a verdict they believe is wrong. But here's what most people don't understand about how appeals actually work in civil cases. Filing an appeal doesn't make the debt disappear. It doesn't reset the clock. It doesn't give you permission to treat a court judgment like a suggestion you can ignore. The debt still exists, it's still growing with interest, and eventually the appeals run out or the appellate courts say the original verdict stands. That's exactly what happened here. The appeals didn't work. The delays ran out of road, and the attorneys representing the people who won those cases went back to court and said, "We've been patient, we've followed the process, we've waited for appeals to play out, and we still haven't seen a dime. We want what the court said we're owed." So they filed for something called writs of execution. This is where the legal system goes from politely asking for payment to actively taking it. A writ of execution is a court order that says, since you refuse to pay what you owe, we're authorizing law enforcement to identify your assets, seize them, and sell them to satisfy this debt. It's not radical. It's not unprecedented. It's literally what happens every single day in civil courts across America when someone loses a lawsuit and refuses to pay. Think about it like this. If you stopped paying your mortgage tomorrow and ignored every notice from the bank, eventually they'd get a court order and sheriff's deputies would show up to evict you and seize the house. Same legal principle, just with a much bigger price tag and a much more famous property. The writs were granted because the legal requirements were met. There are valid, enforceable judgments. Payment. Demands were issued and ignored. The debtor has assets that can be seized. Mar-a-Lago specifically came into focus for one critical legal reason. It's registered as a commercial property operating as a private club with paying members. That classification matters enormously because personal residences have legal protections that make them much harder to seize. Commercial properties don't have those same shields. So this morning, federal marshals arrived with legal authority to begin the seizure process. They're not moving furniture out or changing locks today. What they're doing is starting the formal valuation process. Professional appraisers will assess what the property is actually worth on the open market. That valuation gets filed with the court. Then the debtor gets presented with options. Option 1. Write a check for the full amount owed, and this entire process stops immediately. The property stays yours, the marshals leave, the case closes. Option 2. Negotiate a settlement. Maybe pay a substantial portion now and work out a payment plan for the rest. Courts allow this all the time in civil cases because getting most of what you're owed is better than dragging things out for years. Option 3. Continue fighting while the property sits in legal limbo, but understand that courts can and do allow seizures to proceed even while appeals are still pending, especially when there's a documented pattern of delay tactics. If none of those options produce results, we're headed toward an auction. Not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually. The property would be sold to the highest bidder, the proceeds would go to satisfy the outstanding judgments, and any money left over after the debts are paid goes back to the original owner. That's standard procedure that plays out in foreclosure cases and business bankruptcies constantly. Now here's the part that should terrify every single person watching this, regardless of your politics or how you feel about the individual involved. We're watching a live test of whether America's civil justice system actually functions when it's challenged by someone with enormous resources and political power. Because let's be brutally honest about what's been happening here. 3 courts, 3 verdicts, over $500 million in judgments, and the strategy has consistently been to act like those verdicts are optional. I've spent 3 decades in federal prosecution. I've gone after war criminals who committed atrocities and thought international law didn't apply to them. I've dismantled organized crime operations run by people who believed violence made them immune to consequences. I've prosecuted government officials so corrupt they genuinely thought their positions put them above accountability. But I have never encountered this level of systematic resistance to basic civil enforcement from someone who clearly has the financial means to settle these debts if they chose to. The pattern is what matters. Here, one unpaid judgment could be a dispute over the amount or a genuine belief the verdict was wrong. 2 unpaid judgments starts looking concerning. 3 unpaid judgments totaling over $500 million with the identical response pattern of delay and non-payment? That's not coincidence. That's a deliberate strategy based on the calculation that the system can be outlasted. Think about this practically. You own a small business and a larger company breaches a contract that costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars. You take them to court. You spend years fighting the case. You present overwhelming evidence. The jury sides with you and awards you a judgment. Then the company just doesn't pay. They file appeals. They delay. They stall. Years go by and you never see a penny because they can afford lawyers who know how to work the system. Without enforcement mechanisms that actually work, that judgment you fought so hard for is worthless. You need marshals who will show up and seize assets. You need writs of execution that have real consequences. You need courts that will back up their own orders. If those things only work against people who can't afford to fight back, then justice becomes a commodity only the powerful can afford to ignore. That's what's being tested right now with this Mar-a-Lago seizure. Not whether one person pays one debt, but whether the fundamental principle that court judgments matter can survive contact with someone who has spent years acting like they don't. The marshals who arrived this morning are beginning a process that will unfold over months. They'll complete their valuation, the court will review it. Options for resolution will be presented. Either payment happens or negotiation happens, or we move closer to an auction that would be absolutely unprecedented in American legal history. What happens next depends entirely on whether the debtor decides that $500 million in court judgments actually means something, or whether the bet is that this can be delayed indefinitely. The legal authority is crystal clear. The process is underway. The only question left is whether our system works the same for everyone or only for people without the resources to ignore it. This isn't speculation. This isn't political theater. This is documented legal process playing out in real time. And what it reveals about whether justice applies equally to everyone will define how much faith Americans can have in their civil courts for generations to come.